All right, guys, so far in the introduction to Jesus' greatest sermon in Matthew chapter 5, we've seen a process of transformation that takes place that leads to true happiness, true contentment, and satisfaction. Jesus called it makarios. That means blessedness. It's so counterintuitive to everything the world says. It starts with acknowledging our spiritual bankruptcy. That's the truth that we have nothing to offer God. We are sinful, all of us, and we are broken. That's what poor in spirit means. The next step is to grieve our sin, to think of how it hurts us and how it hurts others. This is what Jesus meant by those who mourn. Then the third step's very important, of surrendering to Christ. Like a wild stallion that surrenders to a master and becomes his humble servant. That's what's meant by the Greek word praus, which is often translated meek. Now, last time we saw the fourth step, to crave righteousness. This is something that God does when we surrender to Jesus and we make Him our Lord. He does it for us. The Holy Spirit comes to live in us when we are born again and causes us to, as Jesus said, hunger and thirst for righteousness. It doesn't mean we no longer fight the temptation to sin, but that we can't stay there. Like Romans chapter 6, 1 and 2 says, when we've experienced God's grace, we can't go on sinning by no means. We've died to sin. We can't still live in it. And thankfully, God gives us power to overcome sin, and more as we continue to grow in Him. Next, and what we begin to see today, are some really cool visible effects of this transformation. But like the others, we've got to act on them in response to God's grace as we continue to grow. Here's what Jesus says: "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." This means to feel mercy for and to show mercy to others. That's what it means to be merciful. It is to see past people's faults and to forgive them with compassion. Treat them with compassion. It's to have empathy and sympathy. You know the difference between those two words? Having empathy is to be able to put yourself in someone else's situation, to feel with someone. Having sympathy, on the other hand, is to feel for someone. Mercy is easier once you've understood yourself as bankrupt and undeserving of God's grace, especially when you receive God's grace. There's no indignation about others who are as you once were. It's true. We are beggars telling beggars where to find bread. To be merciful also means to empathize and to sympathize with people who are in trouble or who are being mistreated. To be a man who has a heart for people who are less fortunate. Godly men look like Jesus when they help and love those overlooked or hard to love. This includes many different kinds of people. Those who are handicapped with special needs, people who are sick or infirm, those who are abused or enslaved, those who have been mistreated due to factors out of their control like their race, their poverty, their nationality, their lack of education, etc. And even those who have hurt their own lives by their own sin and by their own poor choices. Guys, we are Christ followers who have been shown mercy and who will be shown mercy in the end, who should be the first to have compassion on prisoners, both literal prisoners and figurative prisoners, those caught in sin, as well as those who have made bad decisions resulting in a self-made cell, like those who are in addiction, or those who are in great debt or poverty, or in poor health. Mercy says, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Grace says, "And I will go and offer them help." And this is what Jesus did. He had compassion and He came to help. We can see His mercy many times in the Gospels as He, often to the chagrin of His disciples, touched, the word is, which can also be translated embraced lepers and interacted with Samaritans and women and Gentiles, even Samaritan and Gentile women, unheard of in Jesus' day for Jewish leaders. Showing mercy, guys, is a real sign of spiritual maturity and others' consciousness. Spiritual immaturity is shown when one cannot feel for somebody else. Regarding those who have made poor choices, it's sometimes easy and self-serving to recognize their foolishness or ignorance. We might rightly respond to a scandal with words, at least in our heart, like, "Can you believe that guy was arrested for soliciting sex with an underage girl?" or something like that. How terrible. It's hard to express mercy for such an idiot or an evil person, right? But how many of us will acknowledge how close we could be to thinking the same thoughts that could lead to that very sin? And how easy would it be to look lustfully at images of attractive teenage girls? And what if that sin had become comfortable and an opportunity presented itself with a willing person at just the right circumstances? It's just an illustration, guys, just a reminder of how we are all just a few steps away, small steps, from a reputation-ending, family-exploding, cataclysmic mistake when sin goes unchecked and the enemy sets us up. Mercy serves as a reminder to us of our own sinful nature that is able to seize an opportunity or compromise. Guys, showing mercy has long been recognized as a mark of spiritual maturity and even societal civility. This is why nations that have been influenced by Christianity treat prisoners of war with dignity and even provide medical care to save those who try to defeat or even kill them. Do you do this? Treat your enemies with dignity and care for them, when they need it. It's precisely what Jesus commanded later in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, he said in Matthew chapter 5, same chapter, verses 43 through 47, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you," Jesus said, "love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes His sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that?" Now that's mercy. Have you ever prayed for someone you really don't like or someone who's mistreated you? It's hard to pray regularly for someone you don't like, true. But it's hard to dislike someone for whom you pray regularly. It's amazing to think that Jesus did exactly that while He was dying on the cross. And after He had been betrayed and denied and falsely accused and framed and insulted and beaten and wrongly executed, He prayed to God, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Wow, that's hard. And that's what we can do when we have Jesus. Guys, the reward for showing mercy is simple. The merciful will be shown mercy. Now, right now I'm standing in this notorious place, this prison. It's where some of the most infamous killers and criminals of Tennessee's history were once confined. Guys like James Earl Ray. Maybe you've heard of him. He's the man that shot Martin Luther King Jr. Well, a friend of James Earl Ray's was a guy by the name of John Red Fuller. He got involved in crime early in his life and he killed several men. He was notoriously infamous, I should say, because he could bench press like 500 plus pounds. He had no veins in his arm. All were collapsed due to taking drugs. In fact, in prison, he became kind of the boss, the prisoner who ran the underworld black market of drugs and did the decision making among the thugs here. I know this because I met him. My dad, who was coaching football at Farragut High School, somehow got permission to bring some of his players here. It had an impact on those young athletes, especially those who were rebellious, to talk about what happens when you come here, talking to the inmates. Now, I remember when they brought in an inmate named Red Fuller. He was chained up, hands and feet. He came in very calmly, sat down at a table. My dad told him to tell us what prison was like. And he described things, guys, that were horrible. There was no mercy here. And it seemed a right fit, in my mind, for people who had shown no mercy and had committed these crimes. But then something happened to Red Fuller. One day a guard asked him if he wanted to go to a chapel service that was happening here at the prison. And of course he said, "No, why would I want to do that?" He said, "Well, there's women that are going to be there." The women weren't who he thought, he envisioned, but it was a couple of old ladies, and they were sharing the gospel. They were believers. They had a prison ministry. And they told that God had shown mercy to people by putting our sin on Jesus, and that anyone who repented and believed would be saved, no matter how bad they were, no matter what kind of sinner they were. Well, Red Fuller, this resonated with him, and he received Jesus. He stayed in touch with this woman who continued to write him. She got him a Bible, and she helped him to grow. He began to change, just like we've seen in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He started showing mercy and compassion even to others in prison. In fact, this caused ripples to happen in the whole prison. The whole prison heard something had happened to Red Fuller, including the guards, including the warden eventually. And when my dad called to see if he could bring some players here, they let Red Fuller speak with them. I'm telling you guys, he was truly a changed man. He pleaded with and even scared those of us who met him. I remember him putting his fists on the table and slamming the table and saying, "You don't want to come here. This is what happens to young guys like you who are here." And let me tell you, it was awful. Now, my dad asked Red what happened to him. And I'll just tell you, tears began to form in his eyes when he told us of how God showed him mercy. Well, here's the rest of the story. My dad and some others who heard Red's story began to lobby governor at the time, Ray Blanton, who wasn't a great guy either, but they started lobbying him for Red's release from prison. And would you believe that it happened? Red Fuller was released from prison. He was shown mercy. And I got to tell you, until the day he died, he went into ministry and began to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of mercy and grace. Guys, this happens to us. We are shown mercy when we are saved, when we surrender. And then we show mercy as a result, as God continues to make us desire holiness and righteousness. And then at the judgment at the end, at the judgment seat of Christ, we are proclaimed by God as not guilty. And we are forever given freedom in paradise forever. Let's show mercy.